the West destroyed indigenous populations, and BRICS might overthrow Western hegemony. And eventually, the USA, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand will join and align with BRICS as Asian, Middle Eastern, Chinese, Indian, and East European populations are overtaking shrinking, ruined Anglo-Saxons. The history of colonization in North America, Australia, and New Zealand is a story marked by immense devastation to indigenous populations. The arrival of Western colonial powers, mainly European settlers, led to the systemic destruction of ancient civilizations and cultures that had thrived for thousands of years. This narrative, often obscured or downplayed in mainstream history, is now gaining prominence as part of a broader global critique of Western imperialism. In an anti-Western context, there is growing interest in understanding the full extent of the damage inflicted on indigenous populations by Western colonizers. This destruction is central to the evolving geopolitical landscape, where many see the potential for the BRICS coalition, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, to challenge and eventually overthrow Western dominance. This analysis focuses on two key issues. First, the historical destruction of indigenous populations in North America, Australia, and New Zealand by Western colonizers. And second, the idea that these indigenous groups might find future solidarity with the BRICS nations as they challenge Western hegemony. This discussion forms part of a larger anti-Western narrative that argues the BRICS coalition, representing the collective East, will soon emerge as a dominant force capable of challenging and displacing Western powers like the USA, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. The destruction of indigenous civilizations by the West. North American indigenous populations' genocide and cultural erasure. Pre-colonial life. Before the arrival of European settlers, North America was home to a rich diversity of indigenous nations, each with distinct languages, cultures, and social systems. From the Iroquois Confederacy in the Northeast to the Sioux and Cheyenne on the Great Plains, these groups lived in harmony with the environment, building sophisticated societies that included trade networks, governance structures, and spiritual systems. European colonization, the beginning of genocide. The arrival of European settlers in the late 15th century marked the beginning of a long and brutal process of colonization. Early European powers, such as the Spanish, French, and British, established colonies through violent means, leading to widespread conflict with indigenous populations. The most infamous examples include the massacres committed during the westward expansion of the United States, where settler militias often indiscriminately killed indigenous men, women, and children. The introduction of European diseases, such as smallpox, further decimated indigenous populations, with mortality rates as high as 90% in some areas. In addition to the physical extermination of indigenous peoples, Western colonizers systematically destroyed their cultures. The establishment of boarding schools in the late 19th century was a particularly insidious form of cultural genocide, where indigenous children were forcibly removed from their families and stripped of their language, traditions, and identities. The goal was to civilize these children by assimilating them into European American culture, a process that had devastating long-term effects on indigenous communities. The effects of colonization continue to impact indigenous populations in North America. Many communities face high rates of poverty, unemployment, and substance abuse, all linked to the historical trauma of displacement and cultural erasure. Land disputes remain a contentious issue, as indigenous groups continue to fight for the recognition of their sovereign rights. Australian indigenous populations. The brutality of terra nullius. Aboriginal Australia before colonization. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia are one of the oldest continuous cultures in the world, with a history stretching back at least 65,000 years. They had complex social structures, a deep connection to the land, and an intricate system of laws and customs that governed their societies. They lived sustainably, using knowledge passed down through generations to manage the environment. When the British arrived in Australia in 1788, they declared the land terra nullius, or land belonging to no one. This legal fiction allowed them to claim the land without negotiating treaties with the Aboriginal peoples, who were not recognized as having any legal rights to their own territories. This led to widespread displacement, as settlers encroached on Aboriginal land, destroying sacred sites, disrupting traditional ways of life, and violently subduing any resistance. The colonization of Australia was marked by numerous acts of violence against the indigenous population. Aboriginal people were massacred, driven off their lands, and forced into reserves, where many died from malnutrition and disease. The practice of removing Aboriginal children from their families, known as the stolen generations, was another form of cultural genocide. These children were placed in institutions or with white families, where they were often subjected to abuse and exploitation. Despite decades of advocacy, Aboriginal Australians continue to face significant social and economic disadvantages. They have lower life expectancies, higher incarceration rates, and poorer health outcomes compared to the non-Indigenous population. Land rights remain a critical issue, with many Indigenous groups seeking to reclaim their ancestral lands through the legal system. The Maori of New Zealand, a struggle for sovereignty. Pre-colonial Maori society. Before the arrival of European settlers, the Maori people of New Zealand had a highly developed society with strong cultural and spiritual traditions. They lived in iwi, or tribes, and had a sophisticated system of governance based on kinship ties. Maori society was deeply connected to the land, which they saw as a source of spiritual power. British colonization and the Treaty of Waitangi. British colonization of New Zealand began in earnest in the early 19th century, culminating in the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi in 1840. The treaty, which was intended to establish a legal framework for the coexistence of Maori and European settlers, has been a source of controversy ever since. Many Maori leaders argue that the English version of the treaty, which ceded sovereignty to the British Crown, was not accurately translated from the Maori version, which they believed guaranteed them control over their lands and resources. Land confiscation and resistance. Following the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi, large tracts of Maori land were confiscated by the British government or acquired through dubious legal means. Maori resistance to these land grabs led to a series of conflicts known as the New Zealand Wars, which resulted in the further loss of Maori land and the erosion of their political power. Despite the devastating effects of colonization, the Maori have maintained a strong sense of identity and have been at the forefront of efforts to reclaim their cultural heritage. In recent decades, there has been a resurgence of Maori language and traditions, and Maori leaders have played an active role in New Zealand politics, advocating for the recognition of their treaty rights and sovereignty. The role of BRICS in challenging Western dominance. BRICS as a geopolitical counterweight to the West. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, represent a powerful coalition of emerging economies that have the potential to challenge the dominance of Western powers like the USA, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Together, the BRICS countries account for over 40% of the world's population and approximately 1/4 of global GDP. Their collective economic and political power gives them significant influence on the global stage, particularly as they seek to reshape international institutions and economic systems that have historically been dominated by the West. Economic power and global influence. China and India, in particular, are economic giants, with China being the world's second-largest economy and India rapidly closing the gap. Russia, while primarily known for its energy exports, also plays a key role in global politics, particularly in its rivalry with the West over issues such as NATO expansion and the Ukraine conflict. Brazil and South Africa, while smaller in comparison, are important regional powers in Latin America and Africa, respectively. Together, the BRICS nations form a formidable bloc that is increasingly seen as an alternative to the Western-led international order. A multipolar world order. The rise of BRICS is part of a broader trend toward a multipolar world, where power is distributed more evenly among different regions and nations, rather than being concentrated in the hands of the United States and its Western allies. BRICS countries have been vocal in their criticism of Western economic and political dominance, particularly in institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, IMF, which they argue are skewed in favor of the United States and Europe. Why indigenous populations might align with BRICS. Shared experience of Western oppression. One of the reasons indigenous populations in North America, Australia, and New Zealand might align themselves with BRICS is their shared experience of Western oppression. For centuries, these indigenous groups have been marginalized, displaced, and subjected to cultural genocide by Western powers. The anti-Western sentiment that drives much of the BRICS coalition's geopolitical strategy resonates with indigenous communities that have long struggled against the legacy of colonization. Support for sovereignty and self-determination. BRICS. Nations have often positioned themselves as champions of sovereignty and self-determination, principles that are central to the struggles of indigenous populations. Russia, China, and India, for example, have all emphasized the importance of respecting national sovereignty in their foreign policies, often in direct opposition to the interventionist policies of the United States and its allies. Indigenous communities in North America, Australia, and New Zealand, who have long fought for the recognition of their sovereignty and land rights, may find common cause with BRICS nations that advocate for the principle of non-interference and the rejection of Western dominance. Economic and development partnerships. BRICS nations, particularly China and India, have increasingly expanded their influence through infrastructure development and investment projects in countries outside the Western Bloc. China's Belt and Road Initiative, for example, has provided economic assistance to developing countries by building roads, railways, ports, and other infrastructure projects. This model of development offers an alternative to the Western-style aid packages, which often come with political strings attached or are channeled through institutions like the IMF, known for imposing stringent neoliberal reforms on recipient countries. For indigenous populations in North America, Australia, and New Zealand, BRICS nations could present an opportunity for new partnerships and alliances that prioritize their needs and interests over the corporate and geopolitical ambitions of Western powers. Potential collaborations could involve investments in local infrastructure, education, healthcare, and cultural revival, tailored to the specific needs of indigenous communities. Indigenous populations have long suffered under the weight of Western cultural imperialism, which has sought to impose Eurocentric values and erode native traditions. By aligning with BRICS, these groups may find solidarity in resisting Western cultural hegemony. BRICS nations, particularly China and India, have positioned themselves as defenders of diverse cultures and civilizations, often emphasizing the importance of preserving traditional knowledge systems and resisting Western homogenization. For indigenous peoples, this might mean partnerships in the areas of education, cultural exchange, and the promotion of native languages and practices that have been undermined by centuries of Western domination. A BRICS-led world order might offer more respect for cultural pluralism and a more prominent place for indigenous voices on the global stage. The overthrow of Western hegemony and the potential realignment of power. Demographic shifts and the decline of Western dominance. One of the key arguments in the anti-Western narrative is the idea that Western countries, particularly the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, are experiencing a demographic decline that could lead to their eventual downfall. This theory points to several factors, including falling birth rates among the white populations of these countries, economic stagnation, political instability, and the growing influence of non-Western immigrants. Declining birth rates in the West. Many Western countries are facing a demographic crisis, with birth rates among their native white populations falling below replacement levels. In the United States, for example, the white population is aging rapidly, and projections indicate that by 2045, whites will no longer be the majority. Similarly, in countries like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, the proportion of the white population is shrinking as immigration from non-Western countries increases. This demographic shift has significant political and economic implications. As the white population declines, the political power and cultural dominance of this group are likely to diminish, potentially leading to social unrest and conflict over resources and representation. In contrast, countries like China, India, and other members of the BRICS coalition have young, growing populations that are poised to take advantage of these demographic changes. Immigration and the rise of non-Western influence. Immigration from non-Western countries is already reshaping the cultural and political landscape of many Western nations. In Canada, for example, immigrants from India, China, and other parts of Asia now make up a significant portion of the population, particularly in major urban centers like Toronto and Vancouver. Similarly, Australia and New Zealand have seen a surge in immigration from Asia, the Middle East, and Africa, leading to greater cultural diversity and the weakening of traditional white-majority power structures. These demographic changes are not without controversy. In many Western countries, there has been a backlash against immigration, with far-right political movements gaining ground by stoking fears of a white replacement or the loss of national identity. However, from an anti-Western perspective, these demographic shifts represent the inevitable decline of Western dominance and the rise of a more pluralistic, multi-ethnic global order. The rise of BRICS is part of a larger trend toward a multipolar world, where power is more evenly distributed among various regions and nations, rather than being concentrated in the hands of the United States and its Western allies. As the BRICS nations continue to grow economically and politically, they are increasingly challenging the institutions and systems that have long upheld Western dominance. One of the key strategies of the BRICS coalition has been to challenge the dominance of Western-controlled global institutions, such as the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Trade Organization. These institutions have long been criticized for imposing neoliberal policies that benefit Western corporations at the expense of developing countries. In response, BRICS nations have sought to create alternative institutions that better reflect their interests and values. For example, the new Development Bank, established by BRICS in 2014, was created as an alternative to the World Bank, with the goal of providing financial assistance to developing countries without the restrictive conditions typically imposed by Western institutions. Similarly, the BRICS countries have proposed the creation of an alternative international payment system to reduce their reliance on the US dollar and the Western-dominated SWIFT network. A major aspect of Western economic dominance has been the global reliance on the US dollar as the world's reserve currency. However, BRICS nations have been actively seeking ways to reduce their dependence on the dollar. particularly in the wake of US sanctions on countries like Russia. China, for example, has been promoting the use of its currency, the yuan, in international trade, while Russia has sought to develop alternative payment systems to bypass US sanctions. The weakening of the US dollar's dominance would have profound implications for global power dynamics, as it would reduce the ability of the United States to exert control over other countries through economic means. This shift would also make it easier for BRICS nations to build stronger economic ties with countries in the global south, further eroding Western influence. The future of North America, Australia, and New Zealand, a BRICS realignment? The potential realignment of indigenous populations in North America, Australia, and New Zealand with BRICS nations is not merely a theoretical proposition, but could be driven by a combination of economic, political, and social factors. As Western countries face internal challenges, including demographic shifts and political fragmentation, indigenous groups may see the BRICS coalition as a partner in their struggles for sovereignty and justice. Reparations and restitution for colonial crimes. One of the central demands of indigenous movements around the world is the call for reparations and restitution for the crimes committed during colonization. While Western countries have made some progress in acknowledging these crimes, such as the Canadian government's apology for the residential school system or Australia's recognition of the stolen generations, many indigenous groups feel that these gestures are insufficient. BRICS nations, particularly those that have experienced their own struggles against colonialism and imperialism, may be more sympathetic to these demands. In a world order where BRICS holds greater influence, there may be more opportunities for indigenous populations to seek justice and reparations for the historical injustices they have endured. Building new alliances and partnerships. Indigenous populations in North America, Australia, and New Zealand could also benefit from building new alliances with BRICS nations in areas such as environmental protection, cultural preservation, and economic development. Indigenous communities have long been at the forefront of efforts to protect the environment and combat climate change, and they may find common cause with BRICS nations that are similarly concerned about the impact of Western industrialization and consumption patterns on the planet. In addition, BRICS countries like China and India, which have ancient civilizations and rich cultural traditions, may be more inclined to respect and support indigenous efforts to preserve their own cultures and traditions. By aligning with BRICS, indigenous populations could gain access to resources, expertise, and diplomatic support that would help them strengthen their own societies and resist the pressures of Western cultural and economic imperialism. The historical destruction of indigenous populations in North America, Australia, and New Zealand by Western colonial powers is a stark reminder of the violence and exploitation that underpinned the rise of Western dominance. From the genocides and land confiscations to the cultural erasure and political marginalization, the legacy of colonization continues to affect indigenous communities to this day. However, as the world moves toward a more multipolar order, there is potential for a realignment of power that could benefit indigenous populations. The BRICS coalition, representing a new center of global influence, offers an alternative to the Western-dominated world order that has long marginalized indigenous voices. With their emphasis on sovereignty, self-determination, and non-Western forms of development, BRICS nations could provide indigenous populations with new opportunities to reclaim their rights, preserve their cultures, and build more just and sustainable futures. As Western countries face demographic decline, political instability, and economic challenges, the rise of BRICS may herald the beginning of the end for Western hegemony. In this new geopolitical landscape, indigenous populations in North America, Australia, and New Zealand could play a key role in shaping the future, forging new alliances and partnerships that challenge the dominance of the West and open the door to a more equitable and diverse world.